Hi everybody, my guest today is Tony Platt. Tony is a producer, engineer, mixer whose career started way back in the 60s and since then has gone on to produce or engineer some really famous albums over the years. Acdc, Bob Marley, Iron Maiden, you name it, he's been there and done it. He's got quite a story to tell. He's also left-handed, and I first met Tony about 5 or 6 years ago when we worked together on the Marshall UAD plugins with Softube. Here's what he had to say. If there's anything I talk about you don't want to talk about, we'll just move on. I'll edit out.
I'll tell you.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you will. Right, here we go. Okay. Hi, Tony.
Well, hello. How are you?
I'm fine. And I want to say thank you for being here. I feel very honored to have you. And you're a lefty as well, aren't you?
I am. I'm, left-handed producers and engineers unite.
Exactly.
It's the best way to be.
This is the place for them to come. We've got a lot to talk about. And, if we were to talk about everything, this interview would probably run at about 5 hours. So we're going to briskly move back to the early years of Tony Platt. You always hear these stories of people, they started out as a runner or they started out as a T-boy, but that literally happened to you, didn't it? That was like how your career started out.
Absolutely. I started as a T-boy at Trident. I'd written to lots of studios and not got any answers, and I'd pretty much given up. And then, usual thing, the London bus technique. I got 2 answers, one from Delane Lee and one from Trident Studios, and got the interviews on the same day, went down to London and got offered both jobs. So then I had to choose which one to take. But it was a bit of a no-brainer, really, because the people at Trident were much, much pleasanter people and much more kind of music orientated. I felt the people at Delane Lee were just a bit kind of up themselves, So, and oddly enough, the guy that gave me my first job was a guy called Malcolm Toft. And I was only talking to him a couple of days ago, actually, and we were reminiscing about the days of Trident because somebody's about to do a film all about Trident and the early days of Trident. Yeah,
amazing. So, what year would this have been roughly?
This was sort of around the 68, 69.
Okay, and what was your first sort of job when you were doing it? Like you say, you were the T-boy, but how did it progress into something more at Trident?
Well, the first opportunity I got to do something a bit more technical was we got in those days it was 4-track and 8-track. That was the maximum track count on the tape recorders, the multi-tracks that we were using, and people were still using 2-track and 4-track and bouncing between 2 machines. And then one of the first 16-track machines, it was a 3M M56 machine, came to Trident. It was certainly the first one in the UK. Whether it was the first one in the world, I'm not absolutely sure. It was a bit of a beast of a machine, but Trident's, all the tape machines at Trident were in a central machine room on the first floor of the building. And the the control room was on the ground floor and the studio was in the basement. And then also on the first floor, there was a mix room. And you could patch basically any machine into any of those rooms. Now, the trouble with the M56 was that nobody built a remote control for it. Or at least if they had, there was only one of them, and that went down into the studio. And so the first sort of technical thing I got asked to do was to sit next to this M56 machine in the machine room, whilst Roy Thomas Baker had the talkback wired open in the mix room and was shouting, "Play, stop, roll it back," and all sorts of stuff like that. Talk about a baptism of fire. I was terrified of making a mistake. And then they decided to do some overdubs. So he said, "All right, I'm going to count you down 3, 2, 1 now. And I want you to drop in to record when I shout that." So, that terrified me even more, especially because there's all the noise of the music coming, compressed like hell down the talkback microphone. And then especially because a couple of times he went 3, 2, 1, no. And fortunately, I was able to differentiate between now and no, and didn't actually make the cardinal sin of dropping into record. Because, of course, 3, 2, 1 no, 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 3, 2, 1 no tape machine. It's a tape machine. It's not like Pro Tools. You drop
No,
in and you can go, all right, undo that. It's destructive record.
of course. And you were there really in the very early days of when it was still such an art form, and you really had to work at it to get anything done. Like you say, everything today that anyone who uses any type of home recording stuff, and they know they can just to punch something in, simple, but everything that you've just said just goes to show how difficult it was. What were the type of people that were coming into Trident in those days and recording there?
Oh, well, during that period, there was Elton John was finishing off the Elton John album. David Bowie was doing Changes and Memory of a Free Festival, those sort of things. Then we had Dr. John came in. Mark Bolan with Tyrannosaurus Rex, he was a regular visitor in there. There were people like Sean Phillips, who's an American singer-songwriter. Genesis were doing the Trespass album when I was there. It was quite the Beatles were also putting the finishing touches to Let It Be at that point in time, some of which got filmed in Trident Studios as well. So there was sort of a constant flow of that those artists. But of course, the thing is that they were still on their way up anyway. They had not become super mega stars at that point in time.
Sure, but what a time to be alive, eh? And see it all firsthand.
Yeah, it was very special, and I think, one of the overriding memories that I have of that is getting this job, being really excited I got the job, and then from the first day onwards, just feeling like, this is where I'm supposed to be. There was the definite feeling of belonging and that there was a connection between me and what was going on.
And was it something you always wanted to do? Was it something that you always wanted to did you always know you wanted to be in production and engineering in some way, shape or form?
Well, to be perfectly honest, I didn't really know what that was. I sort of fiddled around at school. A friend of mine at school and myself, we ran we started up a radio station using this wired system that went around. Very, very basic system that went around the whole school. And we did a radio show a couple of times a week that was broadcast in the lunch hour. And I had a trip to the BBC and saw, the inside of a studio there and people working with tape machines. And that was certainly a moment when I went, oh, now this is something I fancy doing.
Right.
But I didn't really know exactly what it was all about. Producers were not so prevalent in those days. You've got engineers and you've got A&R people, and quite often A&R people would also be producers, or the producer would be a mate of the band or something like that. So it wasn't a very clear career path at that point in time. So it was kind of piecing it all together really as time went on.
I think at that time though, you also it was almost the dawn of the producers, don't you think? Not only yourself, obviously, but George Martin and guys like that were quite influential around that time into actually perhaps raising awareness of producers what the part that they were playing in making some of these albums.
Well, I think the notable thing is that we were starting to break out from what you might call an establishment. What's the word for it? An establishment clique, if you like. Up until that point, you've got EMI with Abbey Road Studios, you had Decca with Decca Studios, and Polygram or Phonogram with Phonogram Studios. So there was this thing that it was a bit like the BBC for music, and
sure.
Trident Studios and the next studio that I went to after that, Island Studios, were significant in the respect that they were amongst the first independent studios. Island was tied to a record label, but it was a small independent record label, and Trident was a small independent studio. And it was notable that most of the top stars or the upcoming stars at that point in time liked to get away from their record company's gaze and go to an independent studio where they could just get creative. So one of the side results of that, of course, was that you then started having freelance engineers. One of my mentors, Glyn Johns, was one of the first of those freelance engineers. His brother Andy as well, and
Sure.
And then that led into, I mean, you mentioned George Martin, and what happened with George Martin, of course, is that he turned his back on EMI as well to a certain extent, and went off as a freelance producer and an engineer.
So tell me about the move to Island Records Island Studio, and how that happened. And is that when you met Glyn Johns and guys like that?
Yeah, that's when it opened out quite a lot. I mean, it was a strange set of circumstances. You sort of look back on it and think, well, obviously that was also a circumstance that was meant to be. I'd noticed, I was in the machine room at Trident, and I noticed an advert in the back of the Melody Maker. Most people won't remember the Melody Maker. It was like the NME but better.
I remember it.
And and it was an advertisement for an experienced tape operator wanted for West London studio, and the guy that I was in the machine room with, a guy called Pete Booth, one of the technicians, he said, "Well, phone up and find out who it is." And I phoned up, and the security guy answered the other end and said, Island Studios. And I thought, oh, that's pretty good, because most of my record company were Island Records, you see. Not record company, record collection were mostly Island Records. And of course, I couldn't do anything about it there and then, because it was after hours, and in fact, it was the Friday before the weekend. And I said to Pete, wow, there's no point in me going for that, because I'm not an experienced tape operator. And he said, yeah, but they don't know that. And encouraged me to phone up, the next week. And I did, and got an interview. Took a day off from Trident ostensibly to go to the dentist, went down to Basing Street in Notting Hill and got offered the job. So that was a sort of, an immediate move forwards, and an immediate increase in pay. I went from £8 a week to £21 a week.
Wow. That's a hell of an increase in pay.
Yeah. Oh,
Jesus.
Glory days. Yeah.
Wow. Incredible. Now, when I first met you, amongst many of the great chats we've had, you told me, and I'm hoping it was around this time, that one of your first sort of jobs at Island was doing something on, because I remember telling you what a huge fan I am of the Eagles, and you told me that one of your first jobs there was doing something on Witchy Woman. Can you retell that story?
Well, it wasn't doing something on Witchy Woman. Glyn Johns, who, as I said, was one of my mentors, he used to have favourite assistants at different studios, and I just happened to be in the elevated position of being his favourite person. So I got to work on sessions with him, a variety of different things like Rita Coolidge and Barbara Streisand and stuff like that. And he just mixed the Eagles album with Witchy Woman. Okay. And he'd finished mixing it. And whilst we were doing, I can't remember, I think we were doing Rita Coolidge's album, mixing that. And he got sent a test pressing of the Eagles album to check it out and sign it off and say, yeah, that's fine. So we got the record player out, listened through to it, checked it on the big monitors in the control room and everything. And then he put it back in the sleeve and he went, oh, here, do you want that? So I said, oh, yeah, that's great. It's a good, cool album. I'd like to listen to it again. Took it home and I've still got it. It's still lurking out there in my office somewhere. That's amazing.
What about the other artists? You obviously mentioned quite a few of them there, but at Island, what other artists did you start working with around that time?
Well, there were some of the Island Records' own artists, people like Free, John Martin, Mott the Hoople, Quintessence. Free split up around that point in time and made up several other bands. There was Peace and Kossoff, Kirk, Tetsu and Rabbit and
Yep.
Toby. So I got to work with quite a few of those. And then, of course, we had a sister studio. I mean, I say sister studio. It was more competition, actually. A studio called Olympic Studios, which is a similar size and had very similar equipment in it. And a lot of the artists that like to work in Olympic also like to work at Island. So we some of those artists were the Stones, the Who, Led Zeppelin, and so on. They would sort of bounce backwards and forwards between the two studios, depending on who'd got free studio time. So as an assistant engineer, I got to assist on various sessions. I was an assistant on the session when they recorded Zeppelin. Well, Stairway to Heaven, anyway. Which one's that on? Zeppelin 4, yeah, yes. So I was on the session with Stairway to Heaven. Managed to erase one of the edit pieces for the intro, actually, which was not a particularly auspicious thing to do.
Wow. But you were there to witness it. All these
absolutely
monumental, I mean, obviously there's more to come as we move on, but already quite monumental recordings. So how did what were your next steps after that? What I'm trying to do is bridge the gap to when you started doing stuff with Bob Marley and that sort of thing.
Island Records was quite a unique record company. You know, they had lots of different genres on the label, running right the way from reggae through to the rock bands, and then Quintessence, which was a sort of Indian-inspired rock band. And I even did one album that consisted entirely of Tibetan bells whilst I was there. And then all the way through to John Martin and Nick Drake, of course. You know, Nick Drake was another one of the artists on the label. And we tended to get to work with quite an assortment of those different artists. I ended up doing quite a bit of work on reggae music, actually. What happened was that Chris Blackwell had devised this idea that he wanted to get reggae music, which was at that point in time was largely either very, very dark, rootsy music, which was a bit inaccessible for certain audiences, or it was very, very kind of poppy and poppy boppy stuff, lovers rock and things like that.
Yeah.
And what he wanted to do, he wanted to get the American college audience, the college radio, you know, because rock music was really big on college radio at that time. And that was what was really sort of chasing the recognition. That was pushing the recognition for a lot of artists. And he felt that would be good for reggae in general. So he came up with this idea of incorporating some rock musicians into the reggae and giving it a little bit of a different slant. So we had Wayne Perkins from Muscle Shoals Rhythm Section, Rabbit, who was a Texan keyboard player, and a variety of other people that came in and played on the record. And as far as I can gather, Chris asked for me to do the sessions because I'd been doing rock sessions and I'd been doing reggae sessions. Sure. So I guess he thought that I would be quite useful to bring these two genres together, because there was an element of experimentation and also you had to get kind of creative with it, you know.
Oh, incredible. So moving on from there, what was your tie to, and how did you meet Mutt Lange?
Well, I'd left Island Studios and I'd been around and about. I'd run a studio. There was a studio that I'd recorded a couple of albums in down on the South Coast. It was called Saturn Studios, and it got bought up by somebody who became a very close friend of mine, is still to this day my oldest and dearest friend, Adam Seif. And he bought the studio. in combination with the studio manager that had previously been at the Saturn Studios. And then they asked me to be the chief engineer there. So I'd done a little bit of that. Then I left that studio for a couple of reasons that I won't go into. And I ended up then running a studio out in Italy for a year. And I'd come back to the UK and was sort of trying to rebuild my freelance career, as it were. Because if you go in those days, if you went out to somewhere like Italy, you know, you kind of all of a sudden you weren't a face around town, as it were. So I'd kind of get myself going again. And I'd started at that time. There were projects that engineers and would-be producers were doing where you were starting to work directly with the artist from an earlier stage than just the recording stage. And I was doing some stuff with a guy called Gary Holton. I don't know if you remember Gary Holton. He was Wayne in Aus Wiedersehen, Pet.
Okay, I know who you mean, yeah.
But he was also the lead singer in the Heavy Metal Kids.
Of course.
And he and another friend of mine were doing some recording on just getting some of his demos together, really. And then I got a call from Adam, who had that studio, who said, "Oh, there's a friend of mine who's asked. He wants somebody to mix an album, and he wants somebody who can get that kind of real warm, fat English rock sound, and I've recommended you for it, so you'll be getting a phone call, you see."
Okay.
So I said, "Well, who are they?" And he said, "Oh, it's Acdc." Yeah. And I said, "Well, that's kind of strange because this guy that I'd just been working with had mentioned what he called an Australian punk band." And he said they're really, really good, this Australian punk band. So I'd kind of gone, "Oh, really? So they want a rock sound?" And obviously got to listen to a couple of things before I went along to talk about it. And that's really how it came about. I spoke to Mutt and he said, "Well, come down to the studio." So I went down to Roundhouse Studios one evening and met everybody down there. And he, told me what he wanted to do. And I booked Basing Street Studios just on the basis that I knew that the Helios console in there would give us the right sort of sound. And that's where we mixed it in about 8 or 9 days.
If anybody is wondering, if there is any doubt from anyone watching or listening, the album in question is, of course, AC/DC's Highway to Hell.
That's
which
the
would
one.
Be the first of more than one album that you'd work on with Mutt Lange and AC/DC. And of course, the next one was quite a pivotal album and one that has stood the test of time and is classed as one of the best rock albums ever released, which was Back in Black, which you have more involvement with. It wasn't just mixing it, was it?
Oh no, I recorded it, did all the recording, right, overdubbing and mixing on that album, and recorded the bell, of course.
Yeah. Hey, tell me about the bell. What was the bell?
Well, they had the idea to have the bell on one of the songs, you see, sure. And they'd already started the process of having a bell cast so they could take it on tour.
Yeah.
So this was the whole basis of the idea. And so that was cast by a foundry in Loughborough. And I've forgotten the name of them now, but very famous Victorian bell foundry in
sure.
Loughborough. So we got to this thing of, well, we need to record the bell. We don't want to just use a sound effect. We'd like it to be a proper bell and properly recorded. And in any case, most of the sound effects that we'd found, the bells weren't perfectly in tune and they sounded a bit weedy. So I was sent from the Bahamas back to the UK to record the bell. And I took the Rolling Stones mobile up to
really?
Loughborough. Now, the thing was that when you make a bell, when you cast a bell, it has to stay in a sand pit for a long time and cool down very, very slowly.
Okay.
Because if you whip it out, it'll crack really
Sure.
easily. So this was still in the sand pit. And the guy that made it said, I think it's still a bit too warm to take out, but I'll find another bell similar size or same size and same key for you to hit and record. So they set it up for us to record this bell in a church fairly near Loughborough. And we turn up with the Rolling Stones mobile, run a load of microphones up the bell tower, hit the bell. Now, the thing that we hadn't taken into consideration is that the other thing that inhabits bell towers, apart from bells, are pigeons and other birds. So you hit the bell and all the pigeons flutter off, and you don't hear much of the bell, but you hear a lot of fluttering going on, you know. And by the time the bell has stopped swinging so you can hit it again, they've all come back.
Sure.
So we're on a hiding to nothing with this, basically. So we kind of aborted that particular attempt. And I got back onto the guy at the foundry and said, look, it's not going to work doing that. When's the bell coming out of the pit? What can we do? So he said, all right, well, I think maybe it's cool enough now. I'll take it out very, very carefully and see whether or not the tuning is good. Because the way you tune a bell is you get it, a bell foundry person. I don't know what a bell maker is, actually. What they do is they cast it and they work out the dimensions of the bell, and they work out the component of the metal that it's made from and all that to get the particular tuning. And but generally speaking, they don't ever get it perfectly on. They have these massive tuning forks. I mean, the Bell Foundry had these tuning forks that were like 20 foot long, massive great things. Now they do it electronically, of course. But anyway, to get it in tune, what you do is you ream metal from the inside of the bell very, very slowly until it comes into tune. And actually, this bell was almost perfectly in tune when it came out of the sandpit. So they hung it up in the foundry, and I needed to get another mobile studio up there. So I actually got Ronnie Lane's mobile studio, which was being run by a friend of mine, which was built in an Airstream caravan. You know, those bullet-shaped caravans?
Yeah, I've seen about, but weren't they the two only mobile recording studios? Was the Stones and Ronnie Lane's, wasn't it? You had both of them, didn't you?
Yeah, I think those were the main ones. I think Basingstoke might have had a mobile by then, but Rack had one.
Okay.
But of course, you know, there was a budget at stake here, so I needed to kind of pull a couple of favors anyway. So this friend of mine, you know, did it as a favor more than anything else. So I've got these photos of this old Victorian bell foundry with this bell hanging in the middle of it with Hell's Bell written on it, you know, and then this bullet-shaped, strange sci-fi type caravan alongside it. And the guy that made the bell played the bell. He actually hit the bell, and the samples
that's cool.
that we took, were him playing it.
Wow. Aside from the bell, which is obviously a story unto itself, what was the rest of the album? Because obviously you were recording it in the Bahamas, wasn't it? Bahamas, yeah. How was it? And you know, having to get over there to record it, was it easier than doing it in the UK? How did it all work?
It went pretty smoothly, actually. I mean, I think the main thing, you know, people have lots of different questions about how everybody felt at that time. The fact that Angus and Malcolm had decided, you know, well, we're going to go ahead. That's what Bon would have wanted us to do.
Yeah.
There was a sense of determination. There's also a great sense of camaraderie. I mean, I wouldn't wish the circumstances, but the circumstances definitely led to a closeness between all of the people, the road crew, the band, and all the studio staff and us, the production staff. So there was a real closeness about, you know, getting this as good as we possibly could get it. Yeah. That came from the circumstances that we found ourselves in.
Yeah.
So it actually wasn't a difficult album to make in a lot of respects. Plus the fact that Brian had come into the band and had this mammoth task of filling Bond's shoes, but also doing something with it. I don't think that album would have been well received if we tried to make something that sounded like Bon and the Acdc that went before. It had to be fresh, and it had to be new in a lot of respects in order for it to work properly. So, supporting Brian was the other thing that was really important, because, he had this mammoth mountain to climb with the vocals, and we needed to make him feel like he absolutely could do it, which of course he could.
Absolutely. Were you surprised, and does it still surprise you today, the popularity of that album?
No, I think what it absolutely shows is that when you have an album that is that honest and that heartfelt, and every single one of those songs is full on. I don't think I've ever come across anybody who said, there was the one track that I wasn't really into. Everybody liked every track from a particular perspective. So
it's a classic album. Absolutely. So that wasn't enough for you, really, was it? Doing as that many albums that became so popular already. You then went on to do Foreigner 4 was another album that you did.
Yeah, well, that was by then I'd become Mutt's engineer. So
sure. You were his right-hand man at that point, were you not?
Yeah. No, I guess so. But I was his left-hand man, possibly.
Well, of course, because we should get it right. So give us a bit of an overview over some of those other albums that you did, including Foreigner 4 with him. And the Buddy Guy albums that you did, was that on your own, or was that with him as well?
No, that was sometime. The albums I did with Mutt were was the mixing of Highway to Hell, Back in Black, Foreigner 4, the Boomtown Rats' Fine Art of Surfacing.
Okay.
And another album by a little-known songwriter called Dickon, which we did in between a couple of other albums. And then after the Foreigner album, after the Boomtown Rats album, I was asked by Mutt's management if I would like them to manage me and start getting production gigs for me.
Great.
So that's when things moved to the next gear, because Zomba were pretty much the most prominent producer manager company in the world, I would have thought at that point in time. And they were just in the process of building up Jive Records and everything that went with that, and the artists like Billy Ocean and so on. So, they were very much the center of the musical universe, turning into quite a big, big deal. And so, so that's that. Sorry.
I was just going to say, off the back of that, that's how you then became a producer in your own right, and you started producing albums. Buddy Guy, Iron Maiden. Did you do some some stuff with Motorhead? And that was so many.
Crocus. There was Crocus. Who else? I'm trying to think of. There was the Y&T. I'd mixed an album for them. Lots and lots of stuff, moving around, and then a lot of traveling around the world, which was a lot of fun too. The Buddy Guy album was. I worked with a friend of mine from the Island days, a guy called John Porter, who was the original bass player in Roxy Music, and we'd ended up doing an album together with the band called The Alarm. And then after that, we also co-produced a band called Light a Big Fire, an Irish band, Light a Big Fire for Virgin Records. Probably one of the best albums I've ever made, but it never came out because the band managed to sack the singer 2 days before it was supposed to be released. So the label shelved the album, which a source of great annoyance to me still to this day. And then John had also, he played in Clapton's band, and he was a big fan of Buddy Guy, as indeed was I.
Mm.
And he said to me one day, do you know Buddy Guy doesn't have a record deal? And both of us sort of sat there going, no, that's ridiculous. That's impossible, surely. And it just so happened that Andrew Lauder, who's very well known across the music industry as being one of the good guys, had just set up Silvertone Records.
Okay.
And which was under the auspices of Zomba. And so John went and saw Andrew and said, Andrew, do you know that Buddy Guy doesn't have a deal? And Andrew was virtually kind of, really? Well, he does now. And so he went off and made a deal with Buddy for an album, and then did one of the most superb A&R jobs that I've come across in all my years working in music, of putting together this band of people. And, you know, during the course of making the record, we also managed to get a couple of guests on there like Jeff Beck and Mark Knopfler, Eric Clapton, and so on. And so we made the Damn Right I Got the Blues album in the Battery Studios in Willesden, of all places.
Amazing. An album which would go on to win a Grammy.
Yeah, Best Contemporary Blues Album. Yeah. Amazing.
Absolutely.
I've still to get my certificate for that as well.
Yeah. Tap them up.
Yeah.
What's your approach when you're producing an album? Do you ever go in with something in mind, or do you just let it play out and it's a very organic process?
No, I tend to be a bit more controlled than that, actually. Well, my modus operandi, that's a grandiose term for it. What I tend to do is I like to have a lot of discussions with the artist beforehand. I like to go and see them live. Not actually, quite often, not just to listen to the band playing in their kind of natural habitat, but also to see what it is about the band the audience is like, you know, because sometimes there might be a song that you don't like yourself, but audiences really like it. And if you watch what their reaction is, you can maybe work out, you know, what it is about the song that they like that you hadn't previously seen. So I like to do all of that. I also like to spend time with them, because I think for me, the process of making an album isn't a lot of separate components, you know. It starts when you pre-produce the songs. And if you get that right, the recording goes much easier. And if you get the recording right, the mixing goes much easier. If you get the mixing right, the mastering goes much easier. So everything contributes to the next phase along the way. And this really requires a conversation to decide, well, what album do you want to make to the artist? You know, what do you think this should be, this album? And obviously you've got to take into consideration if there are other people like record labels and management that want to have their say too.
Of course.
Inevitably there'll be lots of people with opinions. But it's about that relationship between you as the producer and engineer and the artist, and where the artist wants to go. So for me, the ultimate has been on a few albums. I mean, one particularly notable one was Dennis Baptiste's album, amazing saxophone player. And he made this album that was all based around the freedom speech, you know. And he, when we'd finished making the album and cut it all together and played it back and listened to it in the studio, we wandered out into the car park from the studio afterwards, and he just came up and he said, "Thank you very much. That's exactly the album I had in my head when I wrote it." And that's really what your ultimate goal is to do that. And I don't think you can do that just by wandering through. You know, you've actually got to have that in your head before you start. I think the other thing as well about getting organized is I like to get as much organized as I possibly can, because then I can put it to one side and just get and be creative. Yeah. What I don't like is if I've still got organization to do when I'm in the studio and I want to actually be enjoying the experience of being in the studio. It becomes very, very distracting if you've got business and organizational stuff still to do.
Was there and you don't have to answer this question, but was there an album that you worked on that this question is kind of twofold. Was there an album that you worked on that just it was all just a bit of a pain in the ass and didn't quite come together as easy as it should have done? And also, was there an album that at the time you perhaps thought this is going to be amazing, but it was essentially underperformed and was underrated?
Well, yeah, the one that I shouldn't ever have done and was absolutely horrendous was Celtic Frost.
Okay.
And it was, yeah, for a whole host of different reasons. Funnily enough, it's kind of popped up into discussion at the moment. I did an interview the other day about the Celtic Frost album, but that was just, yeah, didn't really catch. But I don't think it necessarily was ever going to. It was the record label Noise Records in Berlin wanted to kind of, they wanted to take a dark metal band before dark metal was even a term.
Sure.
And turn it into a glam rock band. And unbeknownst to me, the band weren't, or the leader of the band wasn't totally into that. So there was all sorts of confrontation that went on.
I can imagine.
And an album that I felt should have done better, and interestingly, well, there's two really, and both of them have done better in sort of later times. I think there's Motorhead album, Another Perfect Day.
Oh yeah.
Came in for a bit of stick when it first came out, but actually it continues to sell really, really well. And it's a lot of people have come to like it, and it gets much better reviews now. And also the Ronnie Dio album that I did, I thought, deserved better. Again, it sells pretty well around the world, but it didn't really gain the recognition that I was expecting it to.
And that's the thing, isn't it? It's of course never down to the producer. It's for all the reasons that you've just mentioned about. It can be band personnel, it could be management getting involved, it can be record labels getting involved, and all of that stuff. All you're trying to do is just make a good record at the end of the day.
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of the time it is stuff that's beyond your control. I mean, I remember getting a bit despondent at one point, and my manager saying to me, the thing is, Tony, you will always make great albums, so don't let people run away with the idea that you're going out there and making a shit album. You don't do that. The thing is that you have to have a lot of circumstances which are beyond your control all fall into place. So you take Back in Black, that was a set of circumstances that all fell into place in a very positive way.
Yeah.
And so it became absolutely massive. But another album, I did an album with a band called Shy, and they were on RCA Records, and it was a good album, and it came out. And the marketing department of the record company, for reasons only known to themselves, broke a couple of the chart company's rules by giving two incentives, purchase incentives for the initial launch and release of the record, and you weren't allowed to do that. So the album was due to debut on the chart at number 28, which would have been high enough up to have given it that thrust of sales. And instead of that, it didn't appear on the chart for 4 or 5 weeks after it had been released, by which time the band had already started their tour. So, when in those days, when you were touring, you needed the record to be out, because you do a gig.
Of course.
People like it, they go and buy the record. Yeah. So the record just kind of never made it beyond the top 50 from that point on. And so, and that's completely beyond anybody's control. It was somebody not doing their job properly. It's the old, you had one job to do and you screwed it up. But essentially, and everybody.
Yeah, screws everyone, and essentially ends up wasting a lot of time and money for a product that could have been used in a much better way, couldn't it? Real shame. We need to move on. The last section I want to talk about is obviously you no more do you have to deal with tape machines and all the stories you were telling me about earlier. And you very much embrace new technology and recording equipment, which leads us on to how we both met, because we were about 5 or 6 years ago, we were both involved with the UAD official Marshall amplification plugins, weren't we?
Yeah.
And It was fun. It was, I don't know what you remember about it, but I remember it just being an incredibly easy thing to put together, in that Softube were involved. They said, we'd really like to do such and such a amps. I think they were looking at, originally they wanted to do some signature amps that had come out. And I said, look, there's the museum. I knew a lot of those amps in the museum well enough. And there was an original Blues Breaker and an original Plexi and stuff like that. And before we knew it, I remember we were in studios in London and we were doing it and recording them. And it was one of the most pleasurable experiences I've ever had. And the turnaround was something ridiculous. Like, they were out in like 6 months later or something like that. It was so much fun. Yeah. What do you remember about it?
Well, I think initially I wasn't too sure about it, because I love actually moving air with an amplifier. Of course. And one of the things that I've always been a little bit kind of concerned about with plugins is that the way people use them is they record the guitar track with a DI and then they try and reamp it one way or another. Yeah. And you as a guitar player know that if you're hearing a sound that is inspiring and is responding to the way that you play better. And when you play better, the sound gets better. And when the sound gets better, you play better. So you have that positive spiral that goes on. Yes. So I'd always been a little bit kind of, what's the word for it? Negative and cynical about the whole concept of doing that. But by the same token, the guys from Softube and UAD, they approach plugins a completely different way. They build them from the component level up. So they're not just building a virtual version of the algorithms that they've scanned from something. They're actually going down to component level and building a virtual amplifier from scratch. Yeah. And that made a difference. And I'd never done anything quite like this. So I thought, well, this is going to be an interesting thing to do. And then on top of that, and that's the first time I'd heard actually that you suggested using the vintage amplifiers, because that was the other thing for me, was getting hold of these vintage amplifiers, because the problem that I consistently would face is when I was going in the studio with guitar-based bands and they wanted to get that kind of gritty Acdc style of sound. Yeah. I mean, I always say to people, well, you'll only get Angus's sound if you've got Angus in the studio with you, Yeah. But there is a way of getting that gritty sound. And I just happen to know that most of that gritty sound comes from the amplifier overloading the speaker, not overloading the input of the amplifier. So you need speakers with a lower rating than the amplifier, so you can make them really kind of light up, Yeah. So I knew that we could really get those sounds from these vintage setups and everything. So that attracted me as well. And it was, I think, one of the most pleasurable things that I've done, actually, because the guys from Softube are fantastic.
Yeah, they are great guys. Yeah, they really are.
And complete nutters as well.
Yeah, for sure. But they're just trying to put a current take on everything. And I've known those guys for a long time. Obviously, I haven't spoken to them in a few years now, but the stuff that I'd worked on, at my time with Marshall before that, they've always got these great ideas and they're always just wanting to, better themselves. But seeing the final results with those plugins, I think was the greatest thing, trying them out, because we spent quite a lot of time doing the presets as well, didn't we? I came down to your studio and we spent some time there. I also remember when we were doing the which studio did we use when I brought the amps down?
We did the first recordings at Core Studios.
That was it.
And then the second lot we did at Strong Room Studio. That's
right. I think when we were at Strong Room, that was one of the sessions we were doing with the Blues Breaker, the really old one. And we just had to, we sort of only got 5 or 10 minutes with it at a time before it started crapping out.
Well, it's funny. It's funny you should mention that, because that had just come into my mind. As what happened with the amp was that you turned it on, and it's the same thing for a lot of vintage amplifiers. You turn them on and they get up to a certain temperature and they sound absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
For like anything between 10 minutes and an hour. And then all of a sudden, poof, the sound goes, and you've got to switch it off, let it cool down, and heat it all up again. It's quite amazing.
But I tell you what, those 5 or 10 minutes I was playing that amp at full tilt, and you were in the control room, and I was just in heaven. It was worth paying for. But then it would just go like that. But okay, have a quick break. So, can you tell us what you're up to? What have you been doing in the last few years? What you're doing at the moment?
Well, I'm doing a little bit of teaching at Northampton University, which is interesting, to say the very least. I've got my own mix studio here now. I gave up my studio in London that I shared with a mate of mine, Hayden Bendel. The traveling got a bit much, and it started to cost too much money. And it's great having this room next to my house, because I can just kind of poodle backwards and forwards. And I managed to get it set up just before the first lockdown. The first album that I mixed in here was Soweto Kinch's latest album.
Okay.
And that was great. And then I've been doing quite a lot of mixing since then. There's a female artist from Australia, mixed a couple of tracks for her. I've got this ongoing relationship with a Northern Irish singer-songwriter who's writing for Synchronizations. And we bounce things backwards and forwards between us, and then he records the song, sends it to me, and I mix it. And sometimes we sort of have to muck about with different components on it. I just mixed a really interesting jazz album called The Two of Us with a fantastic jazz trumpet player and drummer. So it's drums and trumpet, which is an interesting combination. Mix that. What else? I mean, lots of bits and pieces. I think the last album that I ended up doing full recording on was a punk reggae band called Two Tone Club.
Okay.
And we did that out in a great little studio in Belgium, in the Ardennes in Belgium, called Daft Studios.
Okay.
Beautiful studio, amazing sounding rooms.
Nice.
Set in that just up by Spa, where the Spa Francorchamps.
I know it very well. I've been there. Yeah, it's very nice. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Great, man. This has been so much fun. Tony Platt, thank you ever so much.
Chris, thank you for asking me. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks, mate.